Okay, hello. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon for everyone. Всем привет. Hello, Matt. Thank you
Hi.
for coming. Thank you for accepting this invitation for our group conversation and maybe somewhere like a Q&A session, and maybe we'll have a good discussion about theory, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for inviting
And
me.
Yeah, and I will just quickly, maybe as we're a lot of people here, and sometimes it's difficult to manage, uh, the order of the questions and everything. I will just say that it was planned as a, I've told you that as an interview, but then we changed the concept and everything. And because we've got a lot of questions, and I thought like maybe some people would like to come and just have their own questions to tell them by themselves.
Yeah,
So we have this group meeting. I'll be moderating this meeting, and it
okay.
doesn't mean that I will be dominating this, and I will not be the only person who speaks, I hope. So I will not translate, try not to make a translation to Russian because it will take a lot of time for us to proceed. But sometimes I will, because there most of the people so it's hard to capture the concepts and everything in English, as it's not the
Yeah,
first language for most of us, I think, for everyone in this
okay.
room. So I will sometimes do, sometimes not. I don't know. Let's see how it goes. So that's it. Maybe you would like to tell something, you'd like to share.
No, I'm looking forward to talking with you about. I think my understanding is that you wanted to talk about philosophy in particular, or the functional contextualism, but any topic is interesting to me, so you can bring up anything you want. If it's something I have nothing to say about, I will tell you, but I'm usually really excited to talk with people, especially from different regions of the world. I've had the opportunity to interact with people in Russia and other countries in the same area, and it's always a pleasure. So yeah, I'm just looking forward to talking with you guys.
Okay, thank you. If you don't mind, I will say a few words in Russian,
Hmm.
and then we'll proceed.
Yep.
Всем привет, мы уже начали нашу встречу. Я буду стараться не быть синхронистом, поскольку я и не переводчик совсем, мне это бывает сложно, но у нас есть возможность задавать вопросы по руке. А если вы будете поднимать руку в зуме, у нас выстроится очередь, и можно будет задавать вопросы. Если ваш вопрос на русском, вы его зададите на русском, я его переведу мэтру. Или кто-нибудь, вот кто, вот, я знаю, говорит хорошо на английском, мы сможем его перевести, я его переведу вам ответ, или мы групповой попробуем его перевести. Если есть возможность написать что-то, пользуйтесь чатом, чат будет открыт для каких-то бесед, для задавания вопросов тоже. В целом есть возможность активно поучаствовать на этой встрече, там, задавать вопросы по философии контекстуализма, по бихевиоризму, или конкретно по теории реляционных фреймов, там, или еще любой вопрос, что касается нашей какой-то темы по контексту. Окей? Есть ли какие-то вопросы ко мне пока? Видимо, вопросов нет. Okay, then should we proceed? So the concept was like talking about philosophy, philosophy of especially functional contextualism, as the most of the people are have been trained as ACT therapists, and some some people, they were like, we were reading a book or
Hmm.
mastering the clinical conversation. And I've had some like trainings with you too before. So that was interesting to talk about this topic, functional contextualism, behaviorism, RFT,
Yeah.
maybe in some cases ACT. So I've got a few questions prepared.
Okay.
Some of the colleagues, they sent me before, and we also have some time. We've got 1.5 hours, yes? 90
Yeah, that's
minutes.
fine. Yeah. Hmm.
So we'll have plenty of time. Maybe some of the members who are right now here, they will like have questions,
Hmm.
and we'll try to translate, or maybe they will ask in English. So the mic is open. Maybe they will raise their hands, and so okay. Most of the people are Russian speaking, so this is Russian speaking community who practice ACT, CBT, or functional analytic psychotherapy, which as we just talked about before. Okay, should we start then?
Ready when you are.
Okay, I'm ready. I've prepared a few questions, and I've written them down. And if you don't mind, I will send them into the chat box so you can see them, and then we'll read them aloud. So we have one question. So it's quite a long question from one colleague of ours. So it's more about like hierarchical framing. It says, so in clinical work, we often use hierarchical framing. Moreover, both we go up the hierarchy from I am the content, I'm sick, I'm angry, so I'm a to I'm a container, to this transcendent self. So the question follows as we go down the hierarchy, splitting into the parts, a rigid structure. For example, I'm the boss here I'm the patient, here I'm the parent. So in both cases, we are moving toward flexibility. So in clinical work, we choose whether to move up or down the hierarchy based on our experience, intuition, and other factors. So in your opinion, as a RFT trainer, so are there any, as I translated it, using the language of RFT, are there any directions when it's more appropriate to one or the other way, move to one or the other way of hierarchy?
Yeah, it's a good question. So if you think of the self, it's the same thing with if we were talking about values, because values and the self can be conceptualized through hierarchical framing. Since you brought up the term hierarchical framing, I'm not going to explain it, but if you want to talk about it, we can also do that. I'm just going to assume that people have heard of it, and then maybe we can go back to the
Shall I
concept
ask?
if it's useful.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe you can ask, yeah.
Окей. Я скинул в чат вопросик на русском языке, поскольку был вопрос по поводу иерархического фрейма и движения вверх и вниз по иерархическому фрейму. И запретил, вопрос такой: все ли знакомы с чем что такое иерархический фрейм в теории реляционных фреймов? Там как-нибудь плюсиком или минусиком в чатике отреагируйте. Плюс имею понятие, что это такое, знаю. Минус совсем нет, потому что будет.
Достаточно, чтобы понять вопрос. Я бы вот так ответил.
Okay, so the people like saying that it's enough to be able to understand the question. So it's being like,
I see some plus and some minus.
Yeah, some minuses. Yeah.
Let me say just a few words and we can follow up after if it seems. Yeah. So, well, basically, hierarchical framing is one of the types of framings. Framing being a sort of a term, sort of metaphor that we use to talk about how we build symbolic relationships among things, how we make connections basically with language. You're familiar with how we can, at the beginning when we learn language, we learn to put things in coordination, like we name objects. Kids learn to name their toys or people around them. They also learn to differentiate, so they learn the frame of distinction. They learn what is and what is not, the name of colors, the name of people, the toys. So that's very basic at first. It connects or it doesn't connect. It connects, it doesn't connect. And then progressively, you start to see the development of different forms of connection. It connects, but it connects in different ways in terms of comparison, in terms of cause and effect. That's what we call conditional framing. In terms of perspective taking, I relate to another person based on my perspective or along the dimension of time or space. So it gets more and more complex. And hierarchy is one of those more complex, advanced ways that we build connections. It refers to the ability of creating categories or attributes, relationships like container, content, belonging to. For example, you could say I'm a human being. I belong to humanity. So there's a broader concept, humanity. You can think of all the people who are humans or who have been humans as a species, and you are one among others. So there's a frame of hierarchy in the sense that you belong to bigger category. Often, I don't know how it translates in Russian, but the term hierarchy in many languages tends to evoke a sense of ranking, like in an administration or in the army. If it's hierarchy, it means someone is above the other. It's only one form, in fact. And perhaps the term hierarchy in RFT is not the best because when we use this term, people tend to think in terms of ranking, but it's only one case of hierarchy. Perhaps best would be to call it frames of integration, because then you can start to think of various ways that you create a system when there is and it's a sort of frame of organization in a way, and that organization can be done in different ways. Inclusion, content container, ranking, attribution, and so on. So when we talk about the self as context or values, it's true also. We use hierarchical framing because the idea is that imagine, so again, you can use different representations, but if we were to use like a sort of pyramid, like a ranking, you would have at the top of the pyramid, you would have the self as context or the value, if we were talking about values. And then inside of that, like you described in your question, you could split it up into varieties of self concepts, experiences, behaviors. So you can see that when you get at the bottom of the pyramid, there is more diversity, more complexity that arises, right? So let's say I see myself as just the observer of myself, the context of myself as context. You can name it in many different ways, but transcendent self that observes everything, that has been with me the whole time, will be there no matter what I do, no matter what I experience, my roles in life, the changes, my physical changes. It always goes back to, at the highest level, conceptualization, it's still me, right? But then when you go down in the hierarchy, that's where you see a lot of variabilities in the content. Like right now, I'm talking with you. A couple of hours later, I will be talking to somebody else. Later, I will be with my kids. There's a lot of changes in my experiences, in my roles, in the way I see myself. But at the top, there you have that common feature, right? It's what continues to be true across experiences. Same thing if we were talking about values. If I value sharing knowledge with others, like I do, right now is a moment when I'm doing it with you. I can do it with my kids when they ask me questions, any kind of questions about how to use their toys or questions about life. It could be with talking with a neighbor who is asking me a question about the building. Every time I have the opportunity to share my knowledge, even with myself in self-reflection, I ask myself questions and I think about things. It's a moment of sharing my knowledge. So again, you see the variability of ways of expressing something that is common and that is extracted conceptually at the top of the hierarchy. So we find that same dynamic. So now to answer your question, when would we go up or down? Well, a relatively simple way of thinking about it is depending on what the client needs. If the client needs more flexibility, more openness, more variability in their experience right now, then that might be a good idea to go down the hierarchy because that's where you're going to find variability. Let's say, for example, someone values sharing knowledge with others, used to be a teacher, but is retiring now, and now is getting very depressed because they don't have the opportunity to share their knowledge as much as they used to. They used to have a certain status in the community, to enjoy their days because they would have students asking them questions. They get to think about how they're going to teach their courses, and then they become retired and maybe their kids have left to live their own life, so they don't have their kids to share the knowledge either, or not as often. And so there is a lack of opportunities at the bottom of the hierarchy now to engage with that value. It's almost like the pyramid is starting to become like that, and then there's crumbling, perhaps could say metaphorically. So you would want to explore how you can rebuild variability at the bottom of the hierarchy. In the domain of self, if you have a client who's very, we would say in ACT terms, very fused with the self-concept, they see themselves. Well, let's stick with the same example. He sees himself as a teacher. He's always been a teacher. That's really what how he sees his role in society, and how he appreciates his self-image. He feels like he's useful to others, and then he retires, and he doesn't have that concept anymore, because that concept doesn't have the bottom of the hierarchy. He can see himself as a teacher, but the problem is it doesn't relate to any concrete experience that he can have. So again, it would be an example of how the concept is not sustained well enough by variability, diversity inside. It's like you have a drawer, but there is nothing inside. It's empty. It's like, okay, well, we need to put things together. So when I find that a client tends to be lacking flexibility, that's when I would tend to go more toward breaking down, splitting up the concept. For example, what does that mean to you to be a teacher? Can you tell me more about that? Because if we just stick with the label, then, well, he's retired, so that's it. There is no variability. I was teacher, now I'm not, so it's over. But if we dismantle the concept, we will start to find actions, experiences that might be available now, even if he's retired. So, for example, I might ask the client, what do you used to like as a teacher? What are the things that you used to do that you would enjoy? And so he'll talk about things at first probably that he is only able to do if he has an actual class with students. I would love to prepare my classes and to have my students, and they would ask me questions. But as we keep exploring, we'll start to find things that are not only attached to those particular contexts. Like, I love to share what I knew, or to explore topics with another person. I'd like to have conversations. I like to read books and then share with others what I had learned. Now you're starting to see that the concept of teacher can be expanded so that it's still alive. It can still exist outside of that context of working. And then maybe I'll discover that having conversation with other people is an opportunity to express still that value. Ideally, when you get at the highest level of abstraction in terms of values or self, it should not depend on any particular context. If you're in self as context, you are yourself no matter what. You could lose an arm, you could lose your legs, you could be 80 years old, you could change your name. You're still you at that level. Not saying it's easy. Like, anytime there's a big change in your life, it's going to challenge that sense of self as context. But it's also an opportunity to grow an even more transcendent self as context. Why would I go up? I go up if the opposite, if I find that the client lacks a sense of grounding, right? You can look at really almost all psychological issues as a dynamic between coherence, the sense of coming together, and on the other hand, flexibility. That's why we use this pyramid. At the top, you get things come together, there's coherence, and then as you go down, it's still coherent, but it's much more complex. Simplicity, complexity, abstraction, and at the bottom, it's more like that concreteness of the experience. At the very concrete level, I feel things in my body. At the highest abstract level, I conceptualize myself as a person who feels something in my body. And you want both. It's a dynamic between both. So if for example, if I have a client who's very reactive to feelings and emotions, they experience a lot of change in their experiences. One moment they feel happy, the next moment they feel sad, and then understand why. I was going to work, I was very happy, motivated, but then on the way to go to work, I don't know, suddenly I saw something, the weather was not so great, and suddenly I felt totally depressed. Was not motivated to go to work. I don't understand why it was changing. That would be probably a case of someone who's not very much in touch with their self as context. They get defined too much by ongoing experiences. Okay, the weather is nice and I feel like best person in the world. It starts raining and my self-esteem goes down. You see, it's too dependent on changes in my concrete experience. We want to be sensitive to changes in experience, but we also want to be consistent, have a conceptualization of ourselves that remains stable across those changes. It's the dynamic of both that creates, sustainable well-being from an act perspective. And so I tend to go more up toward the sense of integration, transcendence, when I sense that the client needs more grounding, and it tends to go more down if I sense that the client needs more flexibility, variability. Of course, depending on the situation, the client, doesn't have to be so linear, you always find a different path. You have to think of a balance between both. So it's not like you're going to categorize the client and put them in this box and then say, okay, this is what we need to do. It's always more dynamic than that, but it's kind of basically the idea.
I see. Well, so I'm not. Thank you for such an elaborate answer. So I'm not going to translate it to Russian until. So basically the idea. So it depends on the client, and as I understood, if I summarize this to something more simple, so this is the direction would be if there is a more dependence on the context and more less flexibility. So as you said, reactivity depending on the context. So we go up and up the more contact with the self as context or transcendent. We transcend this our sense of self. Yeah. So if someone is too transcend, is that the case? If someone is being too transcendent?
No, it could be. I mean, probably I would not say that they're too transcendent, but they are going too much in the abstract without grounding in experience. And that can happen when people, for example, do a lot of meditation because they want to get in touch with that observer self. But they get so much into that experience that they start to not care anymore about what they experience concretely. Because they learn so much to let go of their thoughts, let go of their feelings and emotions, that eventually they start to not care anymore. That's not good. Transcendence means that you are connected to everything. So what you feel is important, but you're also not absorbed by it. And sometimes we start to get too much in one direction because we need to go in that direction. That's the direction we need to develop. But at some point, we start to get fused with that too. So yeah, it is possible. Any direction, if you don't have the opposite direction, becomes a problem.
Well, I see. Good. I'm going to ask some few questions in Russian, if you don't mind, or ask the. Я не буду переводить на русский. Это очень. Простите, пожалуйста, если вы не все понимаете. Если вы понимаете, если у вас есть что-то сейчас спросить по поводу иерархического фрейма, по поводу self, то, что мы говорили вверх и вниз, сейчас самое время, потому что мы чуть будем дальше двигаться по другим вопросам. Кто хотел бы, поднимите руку просто в зуме. Okay, Елена wants to ask something, if you don't mind. Well, would you mind? So this is that appropriate? Yeah. So someone will ask, raise a hand and ask a question. Okay, Елена, да. Микрофон, Елена.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you, Matt, for actually in such a short time explaining this hierarchical frame. And I've been noticing that when work with the clients with a complex trauma, they usually get stuck in a very low let's say, level of this frame. And so for them, what I notice, I mean, at least in my experience, and I don't know how is actually, I don't know if I do right or wrong, but it seems working. And this workability, what is important, that we go up with them. So they stuck with some ideas that I'm like this, I'm nobody. It's kind of, so basically it's the totally opposite. I'm a human. And I'm nobody, so basically I don't exist. And then slowly, we build with them this diversity, but going up So to see that actually they are humans, not they're kind of broken or they are not able to do something. And that's like, I really like to use it. To me, this frame is like, maybe because I like it, so I see it. But with the clients with the complex trauma is working going up, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, complex trauma is, you can see an interesting way of conceptualizing complex trauma is that you have some sort of fragmentations in the hierarchical network. There are areas where it's coherent. So, for example, my client has a coherent story about something that happened to them, but then that part doesn't really connect with another part, and you see often a lot of contradictions, denial, right? To see sometimes split of personalities and things like that, where dissociation, because there are the different parts. They don't communicate well, because if they were to cohere, then that would mean something. You would have to transform things. For example, imagine a client, in order to grow, they would have to reflect on their childhood and perhaps see their childhood as not as great as they want to remember, because that would mean their parents were not great, and it would change their relationship with them now. It could lead to a lot of transformation. So it's like trying to maintain a building that's crumbling by adding, some material to keep it standing, but it's starting to become very fragile as you have some earthquakes and things like that. So you keep trying to maintain it, but eventually things could crumble. So you want that transformation to happen. If you're doing therapy, you want to rebuild some coherence across these different parts. And so I like to think of my work in this kind of context, because we talk about complex trauma, but in a way it's the same idea that applies to all clients in a way, especially when it comes to complex cases where it touches on personality, relationships, relationship to life. It's often a lot of little contradictions here and there that you need to find. So going up, I agree with you, but we also often need to go down precise to that specific area where there is a need for repair, and that's, there are a lot of psychotherapy approaches that work like that, especially those who are interested in visiting the history or exploring the content of thinking, like a psychodynamic therapy or schema therapy. They will get into the history and try to understand where in the story there is something that's missing, or something that's in contradiction. Carl Rogers also would work like that in a way, because he was interested in where the client was experiencing incongruence, which is another word for incoherence in the end, right? So there is ambivalence, there is incoherence, and they would bring his focus to that. What we do with that differs based on psychotherapy approaches. Rogers would basically simply reflect back that contradiction with compassion and patience, whereas a more cognitive therapist would ask questions, try to really challenge the client to make sense of what's in the story until it's coherent. There are lots of ways of approaching that. Some therapists work on the body, so they would just get to that area that's contradicting and then focus on what the client feels and learn to respond differently physically. But in the end, all these different approaches get to the same idea, that there need to be a repair so that the different parts of self can reconnect. And from that can emerge a higher sense of self that is blocked, because if you don't have coherence here, you cannot have coherence at the top, or it's an illusion of coherence. In some ways, you can say, I'm myself, I observe of all that. But if you have contradiction inside, it can still be fragile. So yeah, I like what you describe. I think there's different paths. What's important is to make sure that whether you go up or down, you always keep in mind that you want coherence across the whole network. Because, for example, sometimes I see in ACT a tendency to not want to go into the story, the details. It's pretty common in ACT, say, we don't ask why or explore the history because it's going to feed more fusion, more entanglement with thinking, you know. But to me, it can lead to problems where you develop a sort of attitude towards your whole content, your whole thinking, your whole history. That's very distant. That's the idea of diffusion. Okay, all that is my mind chattering and things, but I need to focus on what I care about, just the observer self. It can work, but you can also have a false sense of transcendence. That's what I was saying earlier. You've developed that distance, but that distance is disconnected from the content. And it's just another form of dissociation in the end. So yeah, any direction that makes sense to you with the client, with your style, can work as long as you think of it in a holistic way.
Thank you.
Hmm?
Елена, спасибо за вопрос. Thank you. I think that that leads to one of the questions I had prepared before. So it's not more about, if we start to talk about, to speak about ACT. There was a question about ACT, if you don't mind, and then we'll switch to philosophy. Yeah. So we often hear like ACT is a process-based therapy. So and transdiagnostic process-based therapy and so on. So there was an article, I think a few years ago, about in the search of the process within the so it's more critical, I think, article about ACT. So what is the so the question is maybe for you, what is the what do you think? What is the process in ACT? What are the processes in ACT?
Yeah. I think there are two important things to consider when we try to define what process therapy means. The first one is, I think, the aspect that has been talked about the most lately by Steve Hayes and his colleagues, their research that they're doing, is the idea that therapy is not provided according fixed steps, you know, like how you should apply therapy is defined always the same way with a certain order, independently of the specifics of the client. But instead, it's very dynamic. It's like, so let's take the Exaflex in ACT that I think most of you probably are familiar with. So with the 6 processes, values, action, and so on. A process-based approach means you're not going to necessarily start with values and then acceptance, and then inside each of these processes, it's not going to be always ask a specific question, then do a specific exercise, and then it's not a protocol. It's not a protocol in the sense of, it's not like there are specific steps, techniques that you should do in order to achieve ACT. It's based on context and function. We'll explore that further with philosophy after, probably. But basically, it means that any technique that you're using could have the right function or the wrong function, depending on the context, what you're trying to do. That's why ACT is so integrative. You can take techniques coming from varieties of psychotherapy approaches. Like exposure, you can do exposure in ACT. Why? Because it's in the service of helping clients accept their emotions, move toward their values, develop self as context. But you take exposure and you put it in the context of more first and second wave therapy, and then it becomes, at some level, it seems like it's the same technique, but the function is different. It's to decrease emotions, for example, to decrease anxiety, so that you'll be able to do what you want, of course. But it's not framed in terms of moving toward your values and acceptance. So when you're process-based, you have to constantly think of the function you want to achieve in a particular context. So what's interesting is that it's very adaptable. You're gonna have to always consider with this particular client in that particular context what would be the right thing to do. You have to do in sort of ongoing case conceptualization instead of you do your case conceptualization first. You know what you need to do, and then you need to do the protocol. It's never going to be like that. You're going to have to constantly revise your case conceptualization, explore what's needed now. So it's that's why it can be hard to do, because it feels very unstable in a way. It's like, well, I never really know. It's more convenient when you can put a diagnosis on someone and then say, okay, I'm going to now use this therapy approach for trauma, for phobia, for addiction. I'll follow the steps, but not in ACT, not in process-based therapy. In process-based therapy, it's like really embracing that the humans, your clients, are not things, they are not like a car that you bring to the mechanics and say, it's not working. Okay, it's not working. Well, leave it to me for the day and I'll figure out what's going on, And then you use your expertise, you explore the car, the pieces, you can replace a piece if it's missing, if it's not the right one, you can repair it. It's very fixed. The car is not gonna go away. The car is not gonna rebel against being fixed. The car is not gonna change as you're repairing it. I mean, it's gonna change what you repair, but it's not gonna change other pieces. You change the engine is changed. You're not gonna then see that the wheels have changed while you're changing the engine. In therapy, you work on the self, and then it transforms your values. You work on values, it transforms your relationship with your parents. You work on your history, it transforms your future. It's very dynamic. You come for therapy, and after a session, you realize that you don't need therapy. Your partner needs therapy. I don't know. It's very dynamic. So it doesn't mean we cannot use some degree of linearity, because without linearity, it becomes very chaotic. So especially if you do psychotherapy in sessions of about an hour every week, like most therapists do, you still need to think of how you're going to make progress with your clients. You still need to think of how you're going to fill your hour with something useful. So there's some degree of linearity. You need to sense where you're going, at least in this moment. But overall, you're ready to change the way you're looking at your work. Like a very good session could turn into perhaps not a good session if after you reflect and you're like, I think we were just doing the same thing we've been doing. It seemed like we were connecting, but now that I think of it, maybe I was just helping the client avoid exploring difficult areas. Or the opposite, maybe a session felt like it was not helpful. Maybe we were both a little bored, or there was no sense of insight. But then at the end of the session, again, you realize that, I think I understand why. I know why it's happening. It's because I was afraid of exploring this or that. And now it was the best session ever, because it changes the way you perceive the whole process. So it's very dynamic. So that's the first thing I would say. A process-based therapy, and applies to ACT, is an approach that's definitely dynamic and holistic, instead of mechanistic and linear. The second point, and I don't think it's an aspect that has been talked about enough, I think, in the discussions and ACT as a process-based therapy, I feel like it's left out of the discussion by Steve and his colleagues, and there's an understandable reason for that. It's that if you approach therapy as a process, it means that you cannot focus your work on getting outcomes. And that's where it gets tricky. Because of course you want outcomes. Someone comes to therapy, they want to be helped. So you need to measure if they're going to get better. You need to assess how it's going to get better. The problem is the very thing that you're trying to develop in their functioning is to not assess the success of their life based on an outcome. So if you think of values, you want to help your clients live their life based on their values, not based on outcomes. You want to help them let go of that. That doesn't mean outcomes are not important, but they should not be the goal. They should not be like, I'm trying to achieve that outcome, and if I get that outcome, then my life is meaningful. Outcomes are important, just like, how do I get here to connect with you on Zoom? I have to know what button to click, how to set my time and everything. So there is an outcome at some point. Even now, as I'm explaining something, there is an idea of an outcome in that I'm trying to make something clear, and hopefully at the end, you're like, okay, I understand. Okay. So I'm not saying we should eliminate outcomes. What I'm saying is that meaning, purpose, cannot depend on the outcome, cannot be validated by the outcome. One of my values is to share my knowledge with other people. And now, right now, I'm explaining things and I'm hoping that you understand. There's an outcome element. But whether you understand or not, even if at the end of this session you say, sorry, we didn't understand anything, that's not going to remove the purpose, how meaningful this whole hour was, even in reflection. Why? Because I don't approach sharing my knowledge as an outcome to reach, but as a value to express. Like right now, I don't know if you understand what I'm saying, but I know that I'm sharing my knowledge. I know that's what I'm doing because that's where my intention is. And so even if I fail from an outcome perspective, I won't fail from a values perspective. And so it's a challenge if you want to apply therapy, process-based therapy in this way, because on one hand, you want to be accountable. You want to deliver therapy that the client is gonna be able to say, thank you, it's helping. And if you work with insurances or with any kind of institution that wants to know if you're doing a good job, they're gonna want to see what outcomes you have. But there's a contradiction between how you deliver therapy. If you focus on the outcome as a therapist, there's going to be a contradiction between how you do your work and what you're trying to develop in your client. You might think it doesn't matter. I would say it's actually very, very important. Because in the end, you're not a model of what you're trying to develop in your client. And we see that, I think, a lot in ACT, is that, and I've been there, I've done that too, is that we're trying to, for example, we're going to ask clients if they did well with their valued action this week. We're going to measure progress based on what they've been able to achieve. We're going to ask them things like, are you going toward your values or away from your values? And we're going to ask questions like that. I'm not saying you should not ask those questions, but I would say, let's pause a moment and think about the message that we send when we say that. If I say, if I do this action, I'm going toward my values. But if I do this action, this other action, then I'm not going toward my values. Then it means that literally I'm saying that my values are dependent on specific actions. And it's a problem because values are conceptualized in ACT as transcendent sources of reinforcement, meaning you can find them in any action. I know it's a bit mind-blowing because it's like, okay, but well, then how are we going to help our clients make choices? Well, I still have my clients make choices, but instead of asking them to choose an action, I invite them to connect with their values. I do a lot of work on reflecting on their values without trying to reach an outcome. And that's what, to me, that's a dimension of process-based therapy that you see it very well in approaches that are existential, humanistic, Rogerian, perhaps psychodynamic, and not very well in behavioral therapies. And ACT, was developed based on behavioral therapy. So I think there is that flavor to it. I'm a behavioral therapist, by education and tradition. And also, it's also from my personal experience that I speak here. We tend to approach working with clients as intervention, behavior change. What are we going to change? Do you want to do this or that? What's going to work? My work has evolved toward being much more reflective and contemplative. I'm still behavioral in my sense, but instead of working on changing my clients' behavior, I think more in terms of how I want to help them develop a connection with their values. It's still behavior, so I'm developing a behavior, of course, but the behavior that I'm developing is the ability of connecting with values. So I spend more time asking clients to talk about what's important to them, why things are important to them, how they feel when they think about all these things. A lot of reflections to build that valuing process, and from there they do actions. Sometimes they change what they do as a result. They change their life because they're more clear with their values. Sometimes they don't change their actions, but their actions have more meaning now. So for example, a client who struggles to enjoy parenting. I love my kids. I spend time with my kids and all, but I always feel like I would like to be doing something else. I love my work, or it's hard for me to really enjoy my time with them. They're young. Let's say you have a client who says something like that. Through exploring values around parenting and what it means to the client and what he thinks, maybe the client is not going to change what they were doing. They're still going to spend the same amount of time with their kids, but now it's going to be much more meaningful. And they might also change other things in their lives. I don't know. So that, to me, that also defines doing process-based therapy. It means transforming the way we relate to outcomes. And it's a challenge, as I was saying earlier. I understand why Steve Hayes and his colleagues, the researchers on the process-based therapy, I don't think they talk much about that aspect because it's a challenge for science. I was saying therapists, they need to be accountable, with scientists, perhaps even more. They need to publish, they need to prove that they're right. And so they're constantly obsessed with outcomes. You publish only if you have an outcome to your study. So there is something, we were saying earlier that the importance of coherence across a hierarchical network. Well, you can think of ACT, contextual behavioral science, the philosophy of functional contextualism as a hierarchical network. And if at the conceptual level, values are intrinsic reinforcement, but at the applicable level, there are outcomes, you have a contradiction between the application and the concept. And that's problematic in terms even in terms of efficacy. So yeah, lots to think about. That's an interesting topic though, because we're right in the middle of exploring what it means and how it can transform our work, including with the use of technologies and things like that. So interesting.
Thank you. That was
Sorry, it's long answers, but you ask me questions that require a long answer. So happy to do shorter also if you want.
Yeah, of course, these are difficult questions as well. So there is so it's almost like having your reflection on that and maybe. So I'm going to ask a few questions in Russian, if you don't mind. And мы сейчас немножко говорили, и Мэтт вот подробно объяснял по поводу, что типа ACT называют процесс-ориентированный или процесс-терапия, основанная на процессах. Ему вопрос типа заключался в том, что такое процесс вообще, как это понимается, и вот он отвечал на него. Тоже прошу прощения, что я не могу перевести это на русский целиком. Будет записи, будут субтитры. Если вы понимали, о чем он говорит, и как-то следовали за всем, если у вас какой-то вопрос, касающийся вот этой темы, что дальше мы будем немножко дальше переходить, потому что он отвечал, может быть, какие-то уточнения, по руке можно будет его сейчас задать, или какие-то комментарии, может быть, уточнения хотите спросить. Антон wants to ask a question.
I have a question. It's already 11 p.m., so I'm sorry if I will be not too clear with my questioning, but anyway, I will try. You've talked about what is ACT as a process-based therapy, and you talked mostly about how ACT is applied in sessions. What does it mean to be oriented in process? But I think one of the most accentuated agenda of Steve Hayes when he's presenting ACT as a process-based therapy, it's like that's a whole field of dialogue with any approaches that also apply functional contextualism principles, and you can like integrate whenever you want. So what is it? What is an optimal way to integrate 6 processes which we already have in ACT with other processes from other approaches? Because in a Russian context, it's really hard to find a psychologist that practices only in acceptance and commitment therapy. It's always like ACT and CFT and CBT and DBT, and there are always some mixed messages about you should try use only ACT, but it's also okay to use like ACT plus DBT because we have emotional efficacy therapy, etc. So I'm kind of confused with the overall program message of ACT, let's say. Maybe you have some commentary.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So it's actually interesting because what we're talking about is very similar to the first question about hierarchical framing. You can think of ACT, like I said earlier, conceptually at some level, you will have like the 6 processes, and then you want to define them in terms of techniques, because at some point you want to be able to tell, are you doing diffusion? Are you doing acceptance? How are you going to define it concretely? But even the terms acceptance, diffusion, and so on, they are concepts, but you can get at a highest level and say, okay, what is this about? What are we trying to develop, to achieve? For example, you don't find coherence in the Exaflex, but from an RFT perspective, you could say, well, coherence is in acceptance because it's about treating your emotions as normal, as okay. They are coherent as a human being. Any emotions you have will be an acceptable human experience at some level. You'll find them in values because it's all about making sense of your actions and with your whole life and so on. I could find coherence everywhere. So commonality I was saying about stuff as context. The highest level of abstraction is going to help you find commonality across all your experiences. That's how you find universality, right? We're all humans here. If we start to pay attention more to where we come from, we're going to start to see differences. So how could we come together? We have to find ways, things that we have in common. So it's the same thing with ACT and other psychotherapy approaches. If you're only focused on the terminology, the jargon of ACT, then you're going to see differences. You're going to see EMDR, and they're going to say, well, we have a phase of integration, a history taking. We use the movements of the eyes. It's very specific. ACT, you do diffusion, you use metaphors and things that values completely different therapies. Well, if you look at the different level, you're going to start to see that there's a lot of acceptance, obviously, in EMDR because you are getting in touch with your experience through exposure. You could say that there's a lot of diffusion because the movement of the eyes can be interpreted as a way of not elaborating too much thinking. There's different theories about it, but some that I found compelling is that when you follow the movement of the eyes or the noise, the tuck, 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 it's well, you're focusing on your emotional experience. It prevents you from elaborating a lot of thinking about it, and so it helps you stay with the experience, which could be interpreted as diffusion. So the way you can integrate different approaches is by thinking at a level that is perhaps you could say a little more conceptual, where you're not entangled too much with specific terms. That's what I found useful with RFT. You know, when I started to be interested in RFT for clinical purpose, my interest was at the beginning to anchor ACT better in RFT because I thought we will do ACT better if it's more RFT based. But as we explored how to do that, we had to think of therapy work from an RFT perspective. And as we were doing that, then we realized that some of the things we were doing in ACT were just one way, actually. You could do it in a different way. We used to think that if you do cognitive restructuring, that would be the opposite of diffusion because it's about changing people's thinking. But when you start looking at what diffusion is from an RFT perspective, you realize, well, it is cognitive change because you help people think about their thinking differently. So, well, then you're doing that. Or like I was saying earlier, about how you treat outcomes and values. It's like, it's a matter of transforming the way you relate to your experience. So there's a cognitive transformation there. And then you realize, oh, well, maybe there are things in cognitive therapy that can help with diffusion. If you ask clients to take a different perspective on their thinking, to explore the evidence for and against a belief, it could be useful to develop a sense of workability, for example, a sense of pragmatism, being more anchored in your experience. So to me, that's what you need to do in order to build more integration across psychotherapy approaches, and that's the idea of Steve Hayes with his model of process-based therapy, is to conceptualize therapy with concept terms that are not ACT specific, but could be embraced by different models. Whether it's working or not, I don't know. I mean, it's an ongoing work that he's doing with his colleagues. We'll see where it goes. I think a problem potentially to achieve that is that, you know, it's like with the concept of third wave therapy. It was invented by Steve. I don't know if you know that, but it was Steve Hayes who came up with this term. And when was that? The end of the 90s, I think, something like that. And some therapies that we as ACT therapists will tend to categorize as third wave therapy, like DBT, were not endorsed by the developers of DBT. Marshall Linehan, if I'm correct, she didn't see DBT as third wave therapy. Why? But there's some politics in that too. You know, it's hard when you have the representative of one model who says we're going to do something universal where we're all going to be able to connect and integrate it. Yeah, but it's coming from it's like a country who says we can all live together and we're gonna name it the name of our country. It's not exactly what it's doing, but I think they are probably in the politics of research and treatment, some resistance to be sort of absorbed by the whole ACT community. I don't think that's what necessarily Steve is trying to do. I think he's trying to collaborate with people who come from different fields, different approaches. But you know, it's still the leader of this group of people who are working on it. He's been working with Stefan Hoffman, people like that who come from different traditions. But my sense is that it might be difficult to achieve as long as you are the father of your approach. That being said, I think it's happening more organically, you know, across approaches. I think everybody is kind of thinking about how to be more integrative, more process-based. I think it's a natural evolution. I was talking about the MDR earlier. At the beginning, it was built for something very specific, trauma, and the method was very, very specific. But over time, it has developed for different kinds of issues, and even the way you do MDR can vary. They found that you can do it online, you can do it even by yourself with the software, you can use sounds, you can use movement. There's a lot of things. So transformation of an approach is part, I think, of a natural evolution. And perhaps in relation to communication that happens, you know, with the world, with the obviously internet, but now artificial intelligence and all these things, I think all these things tend to combine anyways to help us get a sense of, okay, what are the common processes here? How can we do that? So just to finish with answering your question, I would say the difficulty when you're thinking ACT, it's, you know, ACT teaches you to diffuse from your rigid rules, right? That's one of the things we do, right? Like you're doing pliance with your rules. I should do this, I should not do that. Well, think about the kind of rules that you're using when you apply ACT. And then you start to get more flexible. It's like, who says that I cannot ask questions about my client's history or childhood because it's ACT? Or who says I cannot ask why, you know? Who says that I cannot have an exchange of points of views? It might seem like it's not ACT because it's about exploring the content of thinking, about debating and all these things. But if you step back and you're like, well, wait a second, is it helping diffusion? Is that the purpose of diffusion? What is diffusion? Is it helping acceptance? Well, then actually it is ACT. So it depends on how you conceptualize your techniques. I can think of any psychotherapy approach that doesn't have something that could be used inside of ACT. I really don't think so. I think it's a matter again of being clear with what you're trying to develop in your work.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you for your elaborated answers. That actually makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Елена, у вас был вопрос, тоже я видел вашу руку. Thank you. Matthew, I think Елена has
no, I just had some reflections rather than a question. So I've been thinking that we are in our, let's say, informational field of successful success, which is very, let's say, popular now in the social media. So the therapy can become the way to reach, so basically to focus on the outcomes, and people come to reach outcomes and they are unhappy when we don't. And I think it's also a trap for a therapist. He can fall when the person come and say that, look, I want to do this is very valuable for me, and will help him to do this and this. So basically it's not a therapy. And so it's kind of, I guess we should be very careful in nowadays because the simplification and fast therapy is I mean, it's very upsetting in a way because you work with a lot of resistance in the clients when you meet them, and but I'm for the slow poke because you can actually discover so much and help so much, even if it will be short, one brick, but it will be a really good one.
Yeah, I completely agree. And again, I think it's normal that there's a dynamic between wanting to go fast and show results and going slow. You see that with everything pretty much, and in food, for example, I remember the whole movement of slow food in restaurants, because at some point it was like fast food, it's not well prepared. So then we go back to, no, actually you have one menu on the restaurant. You cannot choose among thousands of things like we have in the US. It's going to be the thing of the day, but it's going to be prepared with products from the market and maybe so. And there is a market for that too. Again, probably the answer is going to be in our ability to be flexible. In my work, there are times when I'm more didactic, more dialectic, more experiential. It depends on the moment, on the client, I try to stay focused on the overall process, which is to help the client become more integrated overall. And so there are moments of contemplation and moments when it's maybe a little more coaching, directive. It's tricky when you work in a context where the institution or society is pressuring you to do it in a certain way, and you don't have that possibility of being flexible based on what you think is helpful. When you have to explain everything you're doing in a concrete way and show why you're doing this, it's important to be able to do that, but it is sometimes demanded from institutions in ways that are hard to reconcile with how we conceptualize our work. But that's also what we can voice, sometimes there are therapists who work with me in supervision who've over time changed their practice. From working in a hospital, they moved to private practice so that they could have more flexibility. They could work without that pressure to fit the more protocol way of thinking about therapy. It's just something perhaps to consider also. The last thing I would say is that the way I think I've made most progress in my own work is by being more consistent in my own life. Like when I say values is intrinsic source of reinforcement, you connect with your values regardless of the context. Well, it has to be true for me. I cannot just teach that to my clients, but for me, it's not true. Because again, it's not so much a matter of integrity. It is, but it's not even the most important for me. It's that pragmatically, I'm not going to be as good in my work if I don't apply that to me. There's always going to be something a little off, and I have a hard time delivering what I want to deliver if I'm like inside, I'm like, I don't know how to do that. It doesn't work for me. It's okay to struggle. I struggle every day, but all struggle are opportunities to grow. And for me, it's clear that values are intrinsic sources of reinforcement. I'm not going to ask myself, if I go this way, is that valued based or is that valued? No, I'm thinking, okay, what are my values? What do I feel like doing when my values? And I observe, am I satisfied with my life? Does it seem like my life is meaningful? And I monitor that for myself. And the more I do that for myself, the more I feel like my work becomes efficient and easier because I don't have to sell something. I can just well, that's what I do for myself. So I share that with you. And if it doesn't work, then I'll share that with you too. I don't have to even really put a therapist hat. I just have to be myself. I really think that can be a good evolution for our work. There's been a lot of pressure on therapists across the world to adopt evidence-based therapy, to use technologies, to measure everything. We have to prove that what we do works. And it's healthy because you need to turn our field into an approach that's, again, can be held accountable, that has results. But if we push it only in that direction, it's actually lose the nature of our work. It becomes we lose the humanity that makes our work, and I don't think Ironically, I think the outcomes will actually also fall apart as a result. Thanks for your comment.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I think we're getting closer. Thank you for sharing. I think we're getting closer to the questions of philosophy. And evidence. So there are many questions, and for the sake of time, I think we've got like 20 minutes left. I had a question prepared before that. Then I just, while we were talking about, I am trying to combine this in my head. So as you said, so if we look at this as a pyramid, so having this the theories and the philosophy at the top, and we go down, and at the very bottom, I guess we have the clinical application.
Clinical applications, yeah, sure, yeah.
Yeah, and then from this, so let me say something. How has the philosophy of contextualism, if we go higher here, of this pyramid, have changed over time since it was first introduced? Maybe we'll touch the behaviorism and the modern behaviorism, how it has changed and how it's being influenced, how it has influenced functional contextualism, how it has emerged with ACT, and how it has been changing. And also, how does this, if it's possible to touch this, how do you see that? How does this being like all have the interaction between other areas of psychotherapy? For example, like cognitive, psychodynamic, are there any like overlaps or maybe contradictions and something like that? We all work in one field, so we could say that there's another field, there's another pyramid, so we work in one field, we use different methods coming from different traditions. So maybe it's a very complex question, maybe, but
I tried to give an overview. It can of course be a very rich discussion, but I'll try to give you some minutes of reflections here. So if you think about ACT, the roots are behavioral, as I was saying earlier. So in the philosophy of behaviorism, what Steve Hayes did, I think it must have started that in the late 70s or 80s. The first papers on functional contextualism, I think, are somewhere in the 80s, but he probably started to think about all these ideas earlier. It was more like the beginning of his career, basically. He started to sort of create the foundation of the philosophy that he would use then to develop RFT and ACT. Probably didn't have the whole plan in mind, but that's what happened. If you look at the literature published by Steve Hayes, you'll see that there's an interesting corpus of papers and chapters on functional contextualism in the 80s, I think, and then of course there's more, but I think most of the key papers were published around the late 80s. And then you start to see more things on RFT and then things on ACT and so on. And what he did is you have to read the papers to get really in depth with his thinking, but to summarize it, he was saying that, okay, I'm a behavioral psychologist, I'm a behaviorist, but I find that there are different forms of behaviorism inside our community of behaviorism. There are behaviorists who are contextualists and behaviorists that seem to be more mechanistic. And what he was trying to say is that there are behaviorists who seem to be applying the idea of operant conditioning, classical conditioning, all these things, this whole key principles at the core of the way we approach psychology, that they apply in a way that's relatively fixed. They don't take enough into account the role of the context, the variations that you can see in the way a principle applies depending on context. It's difficult to summarize because at some level, all behaviorists would say, of course, we take into account the role of context. How could you be a behaviorist without being a contextualist? And in a way, that's what Steve is saying, that you cannot be a behaviorist without being a contextualist. But because he thought that there was a whole branch of behaviorism that to him was not contextualist enough, he ended up sort of splitting that into functional contextualism, saying basically, for me, behaviorism is contextualist, and I don't think I don't see it enough in behaviorism. So I'm going to sort of create a branch where it's going to be really contextualist. Whether it was right or wrong, it's a matter of discussion. Of course, there are, you have to read papers from him and answers to his papers. It's an ongoing debate. When I first came across functional contextualism, I was a little confused because I could not see what was different from behaviorism that I had learned with my supervisor in France, who was a Skinnerian behaviorist. It was hard to know what am I missing exactly. I'm a behaviorist, functional contextualism. How is that different than what I've learned? Function, context, yes, that's the bread and butter of behaviorism. When I asked Steve, I remember it was when I joined his lab 15 years ago. I remember he said, "Yeah, that's probably because you were trained in a contextualist version of behaviorism. So in a way, it was like you're a functional contextualist without realizing it." That's fine. In the end, they are just brands and names, as we were saying earlier. But it helped me realize something that I didn't realize. Realize that, oh yeah, okay, I didn't realize there is some behaviors perhaps that are not contextualist enough. So the way it has evolved, perhaps we could say that I don't know if I am like the best person to talk about the history of behaviorism. In fact, I know I'm not, because that's not my expertise, but I can give you my experience. And what I've seen is, for example, the ACBS community, the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, and the whole scientific community around that. It started as a small group of people around the 2000 year 2003, 2000, something like that. And it was just a group of people who were still, for the most part of the behavior analysis community. They would still go to the conference of the Association for Behavior Analysis. So they were first behaviorists, and they had that little branch, functional contextualism, contextual behavioral science. And over time, as you know, it has grown into a very, very big organization that has, I think, not sure how many people now, but a lot of members, has its own congress and its own journal. And I think most people in the CBS don't go to the conference on behavior analysis. So you asked me about evolution. You could say, well, it's almost like you have like a branch that became the tree, or something much bigger, its own tree. And is that just a rebranding? Sometimes we rebrand because we want to go back to our roots. It's not necessary that it's something new. In a way, we could say, by creating functional contextualism, Steve Hayes helped behaviorism go back to what it was supposed to be. He might even agree with this statement, I'm not sure. So it's not necessarily something new, but it's a way of re-anchoring behaviorism into its functional contextual roots. Now, if I say a little more about, so you asked me, okay, what could we find like different systems of philosophy and different psychotherapy approaches? I think you'll have to identify the key concepts of functional contextualism. Okay, what makes you a functional contextualist? I'll try to be relatively succinct here. So one element is the concept of a-ontology. Basically, it's the way you relate to the concept of reality. An ontological stance consists of saying there is a reality outside of my experience that exists, that is untouched by my experience, that's intrinsically true, objectively true, and it doesn't depend on our perception. It exists out there, and then as humans, we try to discover it. As scientists, we try to discover it, but it exists outside of our perception. The opposite stance, it's anti-ontological, means there is no truth outside of experience. We construct reality, and there's nothing that exists outside. In a way, it's the same thing, because it means that you're making a statement about truth outside of your experience. Either you say it exists or you say it doesn't exist. But in both cases, you're making a statement about something that is outside your experience. In an aontological stance, it's very close to the concept of that you find in phenomenology. It's basically you're saying, well, I cannot make a statement, an hypothesis about something that's outside my experience, because the only way I will prove that it exists or not is going to be through my experience. So in the end, it just never ends. So instead of saying it exists or it doesn't exist, I'm just gonna treat my experience. And my experience is made of everything, my physical sensation, my thoughts, but also what I hear you say, scientific papers that I read, things that I see when I look at a microscope or a telescope. So it's not just my direct instinct, intuitive experience. It's everything that comes into my world, So it doesn't mean like I know everything by myself. It's you, it's everybody, it's history. All that is part of experience. So that's the a-ontological stance. It's a relationship to reality that's very, very, very dynamic, very fluid, because it accepts change much more than an ontological stance that tends to be more righteous, more rigid. There's a truth, there are facts, and that's the way it is. When you're a-ontological, you tend to be much more flexible with that. But you're not anti-ontological either, where you say, well, there's no truth. Everybody can have their own truth and perspective. The problem with that position is that it tends to be chaotic, relativistic, and it's hard to create any sense of universality, because anybody can write a paper, scientific paper, and say, well, that's my way of thinking. But where is the commonality? So in a-ontology, we care about building integration, universality. It's what we said about self as context earlier. You want a coming together, but you also want variability. So in the end, a-ontology it's the key concept that will lead to concept like self as context or values. Another concept is monism. So monism is something that you'll find talked about a lot in behaviorism, even in the Skinnerian behaviorism before functional contextualism. To say it relatively quickly, it means that you approach the world as one, in the sense that of course, it can be complex. There can be different parts in that world. It can be Earth, and you can go in space and go to another planet. You can find other universes, and they're going to be and in some ways, there are different worlds. But in the end, there's always one world. Why? Because if there are two worlds, if you can see there are two worlds, well, there's a world in which there are two worlds. If there was not one world that can contain these two worlds, then you would not even know there are two worlds. You would be in one world, or you would be in the other world. But in order to know that there are two worlds, you need to have a world in which you can experience both worlds.
So this is the process of transcendence too, yeah. So
exactly,
transcending.
Exactly, you're in a constant process of transcendence in a way. Every time there is something new that you experience, you're trying to integrate it. We see that in therapy. When clients experience something that's unusual for them, that doesn't make sense, they are very, very disturbed, and we help them make sense of it so that it can be integrated in the experience, so that they can be whole, right? I was talking about Rogers earlier. Is the idea. He tries to find the areas where the client is find incongruent. So in a way, they experience that they have different worlds, they are compartmented, and by bringing his unconditional acceptance regard, is helping them make one. Not one in the sense of there is no differentiation. I can be a different person to some extent when I'm with my kids or when I'm doing my work, but I'm not distinct to the point where there's no communication and I don't feel like I'm the same person at some level. So monism is the sort of process of always integrating everything into one. And why is behaviorism monistic? Well, one of the key elements that you find in functional contextualism is to move toward parsimony of principles. You don't create a new principle, a new theory every time you touch on a different phenomenon. Operant conditioning can help you understand human behavior, animal behavior, social behavior, intimate behavior. Every context, you have to see how it applies, but it's the same core concept. And so that's the idea of needing a limited number of principles to account for a greater number of phenomenon. The third main idea, and then I'll talk about where we can find that in different therapies. The third main idea in functional contextualism is it comes from the pragmatic tradition in philosophy. And Steve talks about that in his papers on functional contextualism, the influence of pragmatism, the school of pragmatism from American philosophers like William James, James Dewey, and people like that, John Dewey, and people like that. And basically, the way it's talked about is that we determine the truth of our theories or hypotheses or beliefs or thoughts based on workability. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, then you can select your thoughts and your theories. A scientific paper has a good theory if the theory helps achieve its goals. So it's very pragmatic. It's the idea of doing what works, and you obviously find that in ACT a lot when you help a client notice how they respond to their thoughts. Like, I'm a bad person. Okay, what do you do when you think that you're a bad person? I withdraw. I don't talk to people. I stay with myself. Okay, and how does that impact your values? How you want to live your life? Oh yeah, it actually makes things worse. Okay, so what can I do differently when I'm thinking I'm a bad person, so that I will live more? Maybe share that I think that way with other people, or maybe it's doing something that I think is good. Or it's pragmatic. It's okay. What could we do that's going to help us connect with our values instead of assessing whether I'm a bad person is intrinsically fundamentally true or not true. So you can see how it relates. These three concepts that I laid out are interconnected. In a way, you could just use a-ontology and you have the answer to everything. Or monism, and the same thing. Pragmatism, same thing. They are more like facets of the same idea. Since you rely only on your experience, in the end, you're going to have to find truth in your experience. And how you're going to know which experience you need to select. Like, for example, should I be here with you right now, or should I be going for a walk, enjoy the morning, or go back to sleep? There are lots of options because honestly, the desires are all there. It would be nice to go for a walk. It would be nice to go back to bed. It would be nice to. There's a lot of things that are tempting. If I explore, scan my experience, I'll find a lot. So how do I know which one is the right one? Well, that's by having an approach that's holistic, and it's part of pragmatism too. It's not just what works, it's what works, all things considered. You cannot have a pragmatic stance if you're not also holistic, because if you're not holistic, you're going to be limited to specific goals, and eventually your goals are going to be fragmented. So that's where values come in. It's like, okay, what's important? Why do I care about that? I don't just want to make money. What's the point of making money? I want money because I want freedom. And okay, now I'm getting at something that's more transcendent. So that's the pragmatic, holistic aspect of it. That's in a nutshell the key concept of functional contextualism. And now to finish my answer, some ideas of where you can find that. Well, ACT is supposed to have all that, but you could argue that it's good at certain things and a bit less good at other things. It depends on how you do ACT, honestly. I was saying earlier, sometimes I think there is a little too much focus on changing clients' behaviors, and I think they tend to sometimes be a little too mechanistic, miss the holistic approach. It's supposed to be an ACT, but sometimes I think it can be lost. It's obviously pretty good with the ontological stance, because the idea is that in diffusion, you're not trying to treat beliefs, thoughts as whether they are true or not true, but you look more in terms of workability. But I think sometimes it falls a little too much in the trap of anti-ontology. You're not your thoughts, you're not your beliefs, get out of your mind into your life. There's a tendency in ACT of rejecting the content of thinking as important, as meaningful. It's just your mind chattering. And that to me has a flavor of anti-ontology. If you remember, that's the stance when you say there is no truth outside of experience. But if you say that, you're still making a statement about it. Ontology is more like everything is important and not important at the same time. It's very dynamic. You can engage with meaning making, but you also let go. And then outside of ACT, I found a lot of approaches that do a very good job at applying functional contextualism concepts. For example, in CBT, first, second wave, it's pretty good in terms of pragmatism, tend to look at what needs to change in order to work. Cognitive therapy tends to go more toward ontology, what's true. You're going to test clients' beliefs based on the reality, objectivity. And it's not necessarily a problem. If you ask a client, okay, why do you say you're a bad person? Can you tell me more like concrete experiences you have that tells you you're a bad person? Or it can be a way of anchoring the client into their experience. They can tell you, well, I failed at helping my friends. I lied to my partner. So now you have more concrete elements. it's not necessarily being ontological. It means also being more anchored with your experience. So that's pragmatic. But what often happens in cognitive therapy is that it's not enough to be anchored in your experience. There is a sense that there's a truth, objective truth outside of the experience that comes to validate that. So there's a search often for evidence, statistics, even things like that, that in order to know what's true. And so the client doesn't rely on their experience, but more on facts outside. Then let's say a couple more examples. I think Rogerian therapy is great in order to apply functional contextualism. Perhaps sometimes like a little bit of that workability stance can be much more contemplative, and it depends on how it's done. I think Rogers would argue that the clients will know what they want to do because they connect with their experience in a holistic way, and they'll find what to do. So you don't need to shape the client's workability thinking, because that's going to come from that. I kind of like that, honestly, but I think it's important to be flexible and to also notice when your client might need a little bit of explicit shaping in terms of thinking about what works. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get into a whole thing because I would have to review all psychotherapy approaches and
No,
discuss
that's
how
fine.
that
That's
fits. And
enough
of
then.
course, that would be long. But there definitely that's definitely something we can do. I'll finish with this. I don't think, like I said earlier about ACT, I don't think there is any psychotherapy approach that fundamentally could not fit inside the functional contextual philosophy, but it would likely be transformed to some extent. Like I said, exposure, you can do it from a functional contextual perspective, or you can do it from a ontological mechanistic perspective. For example, just to lay out the two ways. If you do exposure from a functional contextual perspective, it's going to be about connecting with your experience as you're trying to disconnect from part of your emotions because you're scared. You're learning to actually integrate it. So it's a monistic approach. The object that you're afraid of, that you're trying to push away, it's becoming part of your world. So it's a monistic approach in that sense. It's ontological in the sense that we're not trying to prove that fear is not rational, that you see there's nothing to worry about, you're not going to die. It's actually, you don't have to treat like that. You're afraid that you're going to die. Yeah, that's a true experience. That's a real experience, to be afraid of dying. So there's no attempt to change that as a truth per se. Or if it was, it would be very light. And it's pragmatic because it's about helping the client move toward what they care about. It's not just exposure, so to reduce emotions. It's for a purpose. Now, do it in a more mechanistic ontological perspective, and it would look like this. We're going to expose ourselves to that object to reduce fear, to change what we think about the object, that it's not actually dangerous. So it changed the ontological status of that object. You see, in fact, it's not dangerous, and the emotion decreases, and it may be limited. There might be a limited connection with the purpose. It's like the focus is on decreasing emotion, not as much as it's less connected with the values, with the purpose. But at the core, it's still exposure. So you could still do exposure in both ways. And I think if you look at almost all psychotherapy techniques, my guess is probably you can use anything and turn it into a functional contextual technique.
So it's a very integrative as well. So there is one thing, but I'm thinking about time. Is that so? It's
Can take a last one.
Okay, last. Yeah. Let me speak in Russian. Спасибо большое, что остаетесь. Мы немножко, задерживаемся по времени, поскольку я думал, что мы 15 минут начинаем. У нас осталось буквально пару минут. Потому что он уже говорил, если есть какие-то комментарии, можно задать, но у нас есть возможность, я знаю, у нас была договоренность даже на это, но у нас есть возможность задать последний, наверное, вопрос и уже двигаться ближе, заканчивать это. Может быть, вопрос или комментарий Если что-то такое прям очень хочется, вам можете задать, там, если нет, там, у меня есть что спросить по поводу того, о чем мы сейчас говорили.
Мне кажется, если ты видел много вопросов, которые тебе задавали, то у тебя может быть лучшее ощущение, что все еще не отвечено, и я бы тебе скорее оставил последний вопрос задать,
Окей.
на мой вкус.
Ну хорошо, я тут вижу только Елену, что вы соглашаетесь. Okay, there is a time. I had a sense that we're talking about acts and we touched very briefly relational frame theory and functional contextualism, but we're speaking about like it has a flavor of a practicing it as a philosophy. And then maybe, as you said, so if I don't believe it, so I'm not using this concept with my own life. So it's not going to be like something is going to missing within my therapy. And there is a field, I don't know how it's in your country, and where the psychotherapy becomes a part of medical community. I would say so. It's more. It has its own roots, and it's been integrated into these hospitals and the care systems. And there are a lot of psychoeducation going on. So it's more being practiced like as a providing a medical. I don't know how should I put that. So it doesn't. So I think from my point of view, it's a little bit. So there are some contradictions. Between these two approaches. So what do you think of this?
When I was trained first as a psychotherapist in CBT, behavioral psychology, I remember my first internship was in a psychiatric hospital. And even though I was supervised by a behaviorist with whom I ended up exploring ACT, the whole system was based on the traditional DSM and psychiatry way of thinking, and it's very medical. So I see what you mean. It's there's a more fundamental barrier between the clinician and the clients. The clinician comes to deliver the intervention. I think it's in that sense that
evidence-based intervention.
Evidence-based intervention, right? That's where you see that flavor of mechanism a lot. It's without getting too caricatural, it feels a bit like you bring your car to a mechanics and you can leave the car for the day. They're gonna take care of it, right? It's an object on which you intervene. In ACT, well, you can do it this way, but I would argue that then you're not doing an act that's going to have the best result. It's not a matter of good or bad act, is that I think the best act, the more enjoyable act also for the therapist is going to be if it's done as an integrated, holistic approach where you're really part of the process. And that's something that you will find much more in humanistic therapies. If you listen to Carl Rogers, listen to a couple of interviews you can find on YouTube, and he will talk about his evolution. When at the beginning he was didactic, he thought he had to know a lot of things about the client, and he's going to teach them, very medical oriented. And he said over time he realized that the things that he wanted to teach to his clients, they already knew it. That was not so much a matter of them learning that. It was more different ways of really experiencing their life, and that's something that he thought he could not bring through so much didactic teaching, much more by the experience of being with another person who models that for you. You interact with someone who's acceptant, who's mindful, who's curious and open, and that's what transforms you. The problem is that it's less, goes back to our earlier point, it seems more difficult to quantify. So in the institutions, medical institutions, that tends to be a problem because we want to know what we do, how much time it's going to take, what results it's going to get. And it involves it implies that the therapist is more involved in the process. Not delivering the intervention, but they're part of the intervention as the way they are. Now, doctors across the world are also taught to have empathy, and they're more or less successful, I guess, depending on their their background. We've all met doctors who seem to hide behind a clipboard and or behind a screen and tell you things, and you feel like, where's the humanity? It's a hard job and they have a lot of work to do, and there's lots of good reasons to understand why they might not be very present with their patients. And there are some who are, some who are not. There are different branches of medicine also. There's variations, but in the end, it can be a challenge probably to apply ACT as a more humanistic process-based approach in a context where we want things to be defined more concretely, medically. For economic reasons, political reasons, probably lots of issues. I don't know if in what direction we're going. What I notice is that usually there is a craving for more humanity. There is usually not really a craving for less humanity and things being more technology based and quantified. It's useful, it's practical, being able to monitor clients' progress, deliver intervention through applications, smartphones. It's done inside CBS. There are a lot of researchers, developers who develop, like Steve, they develop applications and things like that. So it's not them versus us. It's everywhere. But as we're doing that, I think it's important to consider how the human factor continues to be central. And I don't know. I don't know if I'm going beyond your question at this point or still on point. But I think it's something that we have to figure out. What's the do we think that in the future perhaps psychotherapy inside a medical context is not actually workable, and that therapists should perhaps remove themselves from that context? In my own work, I don't work in a medical context. I was trained in that context in psychiatric hospital, but then over time, I do work that's much more like mental health coaching, because that way I don't have to use diagnoses, disorders, insurance, and things like that. I work from a perspective that can be very consistent with my philosophy. Now, I can do that. I want to do that. I'm not saying that that's the only way, but that's probably something that therapists also have to explore. How can I do my work in a way that's consistent with my values, the way I understand what mental health is? Like I said, I see a lot of therapists in supervision who can struggle with that, and eventually their practice evolves so that they can do their job in a way that's more consistent with their philosophy. And perhaps that's also in part how we make the cultures evolve.
Sure. So it depends on maybe the person could so being guided by their own values. If someone is, I can like tell someone he's being like more inclined by more medical thinking, and of course there is a place for that, especially with complex cases of having addictions and others. So they can go through this. We can have both in the same book.
Yeah, and it can be an evolution in your career too. Like I said, I wanted because in France, the dominant model is psychoanalysis, so it's not scientifically based, at least not in the way behavioral psychology understands science. And I was craving science because I wanted things to be evidence-based. I wanted more objectivity. I wanted accountability that I didn't find in psychoanalysis. But, a couple of decades later, and I find a lot of interesting things in the approaches that are more psychodynamic, relationship-based. And so often I find evidence-based therapies a bit boring, because I feel like they missed an important part of the work, the meaning, purpose, humanity. Not that it cannot be in there, but it often gets lost in the process because there's such a need for quantifying, measuring, going fast, efficient, that dimension is lost. Probably as a result of me getting older, having life experiences. So I think it's also part of things that will always happen. Your career can evolve, society evolves, cultures evolve, our field evolves. As long as we maintain a good balance between the the need for accountability, because we don't want to just like be gurus, you know, who sell a lot of books or create cults, and people come and admire it, but in fact their life is miserable. But at the same time, quantifying everything, using technologies, proving everything we do and show why it works, it's not a really good trend either, because again, I think humanity gets lost. So it's always going to be a matter of finding a right balance in that dynamic, I think.
Okay, thank you. I think it's time for us to move until the end of our meeting.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you for all these questions. Probably you were hoping to ask more questions, and my answers are long, but hopefully I touched on some questions you wanted to ask by having answers that are more elaborated.
That's exactly what happened, actually, because so while you were answering, I had my questions in front of me, and I said, "Oh, maybe I should not interrupt. I should continue listening." And this is what's about. So someone
everything tends to connect. So in the end, we tend to touch on more, and yeah.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being with us today. And I'm going to say a few words in Russian.
Feedback I can read on the comments. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Мы движемся ближе к концу нашей встречи. Все вопросы не получилось задать, но некоторые вопросы были затронуты, пока он отвечал на какие-то другие вопросы и делился своими впечатлениями. Я хочу поблагодарить всех, кто пришел, кто задавал вопросы, кто присутствовал с камерами или без камер. Всем большое спасибо, кто здесь приходил. Пишите тоже. Запись я выложу. У вас будет доступ на вот этом YouTube-канале, который я положил. И можно будет, если что-то пропустили, можно будет субтитрами посмотреть или нейросетки вам переведут. I was saying that I was thanking everyone who were like coming because it's in our part of the world it's now evening.
That's right. So late for you.
Yeah, finding time and coming for this meeting. Thank you for the chance to contacting with you, and I hope we'll have maybe something like this in the future too.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to meet again later. Yeah.
I you know what? I want to do a bit advertising of your course.
Okay.
На самом начале, да, в феврале у Мэтта небольшую рекламу сделал, я не планировал, но у Мэтта будет курс, и у Мэтта есть свой сайт, и там он публикует и на Фейсбуке группа, где он делает анонсы курсов или вебинаров по части АСТ, про современный бихевиоризм, про теорию реляционных фреймов. И сейчас вот в феврале стартует встреча по несколько курсов, 2 группы по поводу философии. Я не помню, как точно называется. Вот сейчас я пришел. И также вот будут такие группы. Можно более тонко. Мы сегодня немножко говорили больше про философию, наверное, про практическое применение, как это, если вам больше интересно там про какие-то хардскилловые, научные какие-то штуки, я уверен, что сможем про это тоже в будущем поговорить. Или можно, допустим, написать вопросы, я так подумал, можно. Is there any chance or a possibility if we would like have like some questions left behind, or someone will like?
Well, why don't you gather all that, and if you have, depending on what you have, perhaps we can organize another meeting at some point.
I'll let you know.
It'd be easier for me than doing it in writing, because in writing it's going to be hard for me to sit and start typing. But if we meet, it takes me an hour or so. We meet, and then I enjoy it, and that makes me work also my understanding of these things. So of course, I'd be happy to follow up if you have questions.
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah, because we were like, I think we were in our today's meeting, we were touching more like philosophical and experience, like the more like spiritual side of the therapy. I would say like philosophy and less. I know that some people coming for today's meeting sometimes are interested in this evidence-based practice, how it's connected to the psychology as a field in general, how it's being connected with other traditions, and how it looks.
Happy to do another session at some point. Let me know. Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, we could do that. Thank you so much. I think it's our time is up. And
bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.